Well, I should tell you what a meta-analysis is to begin with. Well, imagine there's a group of studies done on a particular topic, and you write a review, and you try to interpret the findings. That was called a narrative review. You use your opinion, in some sense, to wade through the data and try to understand what the compilation of studies reveals. Well, there were techniques developed 25 years ago that are statistical, where you can aggregate the statistical results from studies statistically. So you do a statistical analysis of all the statistical analysis, and that's a meta-analysis, and hypothetically it's more objective. And there's some truth to that claim. You still have to select which studies to include, but I don't believe that that was a detriment in this particular case. And so solid methodology, and it's basically something approximating a cost-benefit analysis, and that has that's tough too, because it's not that easy to assign costs and benefits in a quantitative manner. Having said all that, it's an amazing study, not only because of what it reveals, which is a 0.2% decline in overall mortality, but also in that the researchers felt so strongly about their findings that they came right out and said that this was ineffective policy. And that isn't that common for researchers who generally hold off on drawing that sorts of conclusions. They kind of lay out the facts.
Not a black and white. They're typically not going to come out as black and white, is what you're saying?
Yes, okay. Exactly. And so that's really something. We rushed to imitate a totalitarian state in panic, and the consequence of that, according to this study, was there's nothing positive about it. Now, I've talked with some Democrats about this study because they were paying attention to it. And their response is something like, well, it did help control hospital overrun. And time will tell whether or not that's true. I think the data suggesting that COVID vaccines decreased the seriousness of illness when people contracted COVID who were vaccinated, I think that data is credible. I could be wrong about that because things are being done in a rush, and it's very difficult to draw appropriate scientific conclusions in a rush. But I think the bulk of the information suggests that. But I also think that is not how they were marketed, and that was not the initial intent, to merely reduce severity of the illness. It was to reduce transmission and so forth. And then, of course, this is a cost-benefit analysis, which says, yeah, there was some gain on that front, conceivably, maybe, although all-cause mortality doesn't seem to have gone down much at all. But the secondary consequences were devastating. And, well, we don't even know what the secondary consequences are yet. You know, here's one secondary consequence, which is revealed in what you just read. The collusion of the press and the government. Like, how do you know that's not worse than the epidemic? It could easily be worse than the epidemic. Or the idea that now we've been coerced into having to share our medical information with people all through the bureaucratic hierarchy, all the way down to servers in restaurants. So we've trained people that that's okay to ask and also to offer. Is that worse than the pandemic? Well, these are arguably, all of this involves violation of our fundamental rights. Where's the evidence that that's not worse? Well, we're going to see it play out. Well, the collusion between the press and the government, that's so intense in Canada, as already said. When the ex-premier of Newfoundland wanted to launch his constitutional challenge, he couldn't use a mainstream news source. I mean, that's a bloody catastrophe. Much as I dislike CBC, which is a lot, by the way, I think that it's an absolute catastrophe that it's come to that. And that's just one of two consequences of the lockdown. There's the supply chain problem. That's a big one. My publisher, Penguin, told me a week and a half ago, we were talking about putting out a 2-volume set of my last 2 books, which I would really like to do. They're going to do that in Great Britain. I think that people would turn to it as a gift for graduations and so on. That would be a nice set for that. They told me they can't get paper. This is Penguin Random House, right? And it's paper. Paper isn't that complex, given how complex everything is. The fact that there are paper shortages, that's a big deal. I was in a Mazda dealership in Canada a couple of be a couple of months ago now, they had one car. One isn't very many cars, you know, and so we have no idea what the supply line crunch is going to produce in terms of economic catastrophe.
Seriously, though.
And then the next issue is, well, how about all the money we've been printing? You know, we've already seen that produce a massive bubble expansion in housing prices. That's being driven by other factors.
Yep.
How do we know that's not worse than the pandemic? You know, it could easily be. I'm not saying that it is because I don't know, but that's the issue. I don't know. And this is partly why this mad rush to impose top-down solutions to complex problems, this is in some sense what makes me a conservative insofar as I am. It's part of the caution I learned as a social scientist. Social scientists, I'll give you an example. This is a good example. I worked with this woman named Joan McCord, and she was one of America's great criminologists, and a woman who was involved as a faculty member when very few women were. She participated in a study in Boston, in Somerville, which was a working class community back in the 30s. They did the first large-scale intervention to deflect children from a criminal pathway. So they're looking at deprived inner-city kids, thinking they have a higher probability than average to become criminal and to suffer all sorts of other negative consequences as well, or to inflict them. And perhaps you could intervene at an early age and stop that, or slow it down at least. And so they put together a very comprehensive set of interventions, parental lessons for the parents, lessons for the kids, health and nutrition interventions, a whole broad spectrum of all the things you think. This was in the United States, in Somerville, Massachusetts, famous study, the Somerville study. One of the first large-scale psychological public health interventions, I would say, and targeting a problem that was troublesome for left-wing people and right-wing people alike. The right-wingers would think, well, fewer criminals, that's good. And the left-wingers would think, well, let's do some remediation at the root of the cause. So everyone was hoping this worked. And everyone was happy about it. The kids thought it was good. The parents thought it was good. The researchers thought it was good. They also took the kids out of the inner city in the summer and put them out in camp because of nature and all of that. And wouldn't that be a nice break for them? And then they did the analysis. And the kids in the intervention group did worse on virtually every measure. Worse. Like substantially worse. And so they were all shocked, and seriously shocked, in a major way. In fact, Joan McCord was so shocked she spent the rest of her life going around talking about what had happened. It turns out that it's a really bad idea to group antisocial, prone kids together in camps in the summer, because they learn to compete with each other in terms of the manifestation of antisocial behavior, and they get better at it. It's like criminal camp. And so that single consequence of one part of the intervention was so negative that it overwhelmed the entire study and produced negative results. So McCord, she was part of a group of very, very able social scientists that I worked with when I was in Montreal, a broad group, you know, and it was an international group. And they beat the drum all the time. Never, 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 never do a large-scale intervention without building in an evaluation. 25% of your intervention budget should be evaluation, because you do not know that your stupid intervention, which you think will do what you think it will do, that's just a guess. It's a guess. And it could go wildly wrong in 10 ways you don't predict. And if you've ever run studies in a lab trying to predict how people are going to behave, you figure this out real soon, because they don't behave the way, what was the old idea? Put a lab rat in a cage under controlled conditions, and the rat will do exactly what it damn well chooses to do. And that's true for rats. It's even more true for people. And so these large-scale interventions, which the pandemic lockdown was certainly one of those, is like, and this is the conservative objection, the iron law of unintended consequences. Do something large-scale to systems you don't understand at all, not a bit. You know, we have just-in-time supply now, right? And you think about how efficient an economy has to be to rely on just-in-time supply. So it used to be that if you ran an industry, and maybe you're you're a car manufacturer, you have a warehouse full of parts. But the parts are just sitting there, and so that's like money invested that's not accruing any interest. It's a cost, and you have to store it. That's cost. And so that's an expense. And so maybe you want to just have your part supplier supply the parts exactly when you need them. And then maybe the part supplier has to get the metal just exactly when they need it, and so on, all the way down to the miners. And maybe that's in China. Then you think there's 30 steps there, and every bloody thing has to work absolutely perfectly on time for that to work at all. And then you throw a lockdown into that. It's like, well, you've never run a business. You have no idea how complicated things are. You think electricity comes out of plug-ins in the wall. You know, that's not a complicated problem. You just put the plug in and there's the electricity. And you muck things up in 50 different directions, and that's what we've done. And God only knows what we've done. And then this issue that the mainstream press won't cover this.
You think the reason they're not is just purely embarrassed, the fact that this is going to lose even more credibility with the audience, that what we've been saying this entire time, we've been wrong. We haven't done real, true investigative journalism.
I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it. If that was the reason, I could understand that reason. I think it's part of this implicit and explicit collusion. It's like, this isn't the story, and so we're not going to report it. And I think that economically, even that's a foolish decision, because Newsweek, I've been reading Newsweek recently. Newsweek has some journalists. They actually have some real information again, which is quite interesting.
It's still a left, though. It's still a liberal magazine.
But my experience has been in the last couple of months. I thought, oh my God, there's some actual news in Newsweek. And so that was really cool. But I see all this not only as collusion, which is absolutely appalling. So that's the death of journalism, because journalists are colluding with politicians. It's like, well, they're not journalists anymore. And they're also not politicians, because if they were politicians and journalists, they wouldn't be colluding. Whatever they are, as a consequence of this collusion, is not politicians and journalists. It's some completely new thing. Now, I'm less worried about it than I might be, because I also see it as part of the inevitable death spiral of the legacy media. They're dead. And why? Well, they don't have a monopoly over the dissemination of information at all. YouTube, for all of its flaws, which are manifold, is an unbelievably powerful and accessible technology where the cost of entry is zero. It's like no TV station can compete with that, period. They're done. And then these print media sources, especially when they're great people, Barry Weiss might be an example, leave because they can't say what they want to. They don't have to lose much of their talent before all they've got left is hacks. And then everyone can publish to an international audience instantly online. So part of what we're seeing in the mainstream media is a technologically fueled death spiral. And I know how large corporations die. So there's this principle, Pareto principle, which is that the square root of the number of people in a given creative enterprise do half the work. And so if you're a news organization with 1,000 people, 30 of them do half the work. And you think, no, and you can think that all you want, but you're just wrong, because this is one of the most well-established findings in social science, period. So you got 1,000 people, and 970 of them are putting in time, and 30 of them are doing half the work. And then something shifts. Those people can't say what they want to say, let's say.
The 30.
The 30. Well, what do? Well, they leave. Why? Because they can, right? These are people, these are competent people. They're really smart. They're on the edge. They're tough. They have immense networks of connections. As soon as the ship rocks, they think, ciao, you think I need you. It's like you got your priorities wrong. You need me. They go off like Barry Weiss did and start their own thing. And so then you're left with the 970 that was only doing half the work.
Yep.
And then the next 30 competent people leave. And soon all you've got is people who run the legacy media. And they say things like, well, Joe Rogan, people shouldn't listen to him because he just wings it. It's like, how clueless can you possibly be? Or you have people like at CNN who treat Rogan like he's an outsider, despite the fact that he's pulling in numbers that are at least 5 to 8 times their average viewership. Joe is fringe. It's like, really? We'll see who's fringe here. And part of this is purely technological. It's like, there's no way these legacy apparatuses can compete. How can they? Printing with universal distribution is free. Video with universal distribution is free. How can a network possibly compete? It can't. So spiral death. And as they die, they lose their editors, they lose their fact checkers, they lose their good journalists, they lose everybody with courage. And then they put out pablum, and they're tempted by clickbait, because that's what you have to do while you're dying. It's like, Christ, we have to attract attention somehow. So you say, well, Joe Rogan apologized, and everybody clicks on it, and they read it, and they think that's a lie, and so you've lost another 5% of your viewership.
CNN is probably sitting in their board meetings saying, God, please, we need Trump to be president again, because when he was president, we were making money. We need somebody like that to be president. They're begging this guy to come back. Can you imagine if CNN ends up like putting him on left and right to berate him, but at the same time they're getting more eyeballs? But
the fact that China is a totalitarian state has had a very negative consequence on us in the West, especially in the immediate what would you call it? In the immediate emergence of the pandemic, because what we did was we rushed to imitate a totalitarian state. We thought, Chinese lockdown, we better do it. It's like, really? Really? We better do what the CCP did. Well, that's what we did. And we'll see. We don't know what the consequence of that is yet. We'll see. Not good. Not good, in my estimation. And certainly the Johns Hopkins study seems to, it's only a partial study in some sense. They've done the cost-benefit analysis. Costs so far. We have no idea what the costs are of having kids in masks for 2 years. We have no idea what the consequences are. What that's done, especially to introverted kids who are high in negative emotion, because they're going to be looking for a reason to hide anyways. And who knows what that's done to their psychological development, both as children and as adolescents. We'll find out over time, but we haven't paid the price for the pandemic lockdowns even a little bit yet. Did we destroy our economy? Like, these things take a long time. You know, they say if you're piloting an oil tanker and you detect an iceberg in your path, you can see it, you've already hit it, because it takes so long for you to turn that it's too late. Well, in some sense, these huge systems that we're a part of are like that, is that you can't tell when they're broken because they take a long time to fall over. And I don't know if our system is broken, but we're going to find out. And I don't know if the pandemic lockdowns broke it, and maybe they didn't, and hopefully they didn't. I mean, I was in New York City, in Manhattan, a month ago, and it was the first time I'd really gone out anywhere other than Toronto. And I'd been to New York a few years before, and it's a bouncing place, Manhattan. I love New York. It's such an amazing city. You know, the fact that Manhattan can even exist is just an ongoing absolute miracle. 7 million people compressed onto that island, and it's pretty damn clean, and it's pretty safe, and it's really cool, and there's something to do all the time, and you can walk around free, and like, that bloody place is a miracle, that's for sure. And it looked pretty good. I thought, isn't this something? These people have been locked down for like 18 months, and this place isn't on fire. It actually is pretty clean, and most of the businesses are still open, and isn't that a bloody miracle? And which it most definitely is. And so let's pray and not be too resentful about all the foolishness. Let's pray that we wake up and we treat the pandemic like the flu, and we get back to something resembling the normality of Florida, and we put this behind us, and we don't get too upset about January 6th, and we don't get too vengeful about the Democrats and the radical left, and we elect someone half sensible to run the Republicans, and we carefully weave our way through to a peaceful future. Let's pray for that, because the alternative is pretty damn dismal. And I don't think we have to have the alternative.